A woman arrives in a Colorado mountain town carrying a leather pouch full of someone else's goodbyes. 11 letters from a dying wife to a husband she'll never see again. She promised to deliver them and leave in 3 days. But what she doesn't know is that the woman who sent her planned this whole thing from her deathbed. And somewhere in that pouch, there is a 12th letter with Eleanor's name on it that she isn't allowed to read until she proves she's ready. Stay right here, because this story will change the way you think about what it means to belong to a family. Hit like, drop a comment, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe. You don't want to miss what comes next.
The wheels of the stagecoach groaned against the hard-packed snow. Spring in Blackwood Pine, Colorado, was just winter with the sun out. The wind still had teeth. It bit through the cracks of the wooden boardwalks and rattled the glass of Beatrice Alden's boarding house. Beatrice stood by the front window. She'd have been standing there long enough to know how to read people before their boots hit the dirt. She watched the stagecoach settle. A woman stepped down, gray wool coat, simple hat. Shoulders pulled back tight. But it was her hands that caught Beatrice's eye. The woman held a battered leather pouch pressed against her ribs. She didn't hold it like luggage. She held it like a heartbeat, like a fragile, breathing thing that might break if she let up the pressure. She's not here to take something, Beatrice thought. She is here to leave something behind. The boarding house door opened, letting in a swirl of mountain air. The woman stepped inside. She didn't look around with the wide-eyed wonder of a tourist, nor the desperate panic of someone on the run. She just looked tired, a deep, bone-settled kind of tired room, the woman said. Her voice was quiet, but it didn't shake. Just for 3 days, please. Beatrice wiped down the oak counter. She didn't ask where the woman came from. Out west, a person wasn't defined by the dust on their boots or the town they left behind. They were defined by how they stood in the room today. That was the unwritten rule of Blackwood Pine. Respect the present nor the past. 3 days, Beatrice, she slid. Brass key across the wood. Name? Eleanor? Eleanor Vance. Beatrice Alden. You visiting family, Eleanor? No. Eleanor looked down at the leather pouch. I have a delivery for a man named Silas Montgomery. Beatrice stopped wiping the counter. The rag went still. She looked at the woman, really looked at her this time. Silas Montgomery lives 4 miles up the ridge, Beatrice said, her voice dropping a register. And he don't take kindly to deliveries, or visitors, or much of anything these days. It isn't a delivery he asked for. Beatrice let out a short, dry breath. Those are the worst kind. You'll need a horse or a strong pair of legs. The snow's still thick up there. I can walk, Beatrice nodded. She didn't press. She didn't ask what was in the pouch. Room 4, top of the stairs. Dinner's at 6. The room was small. A bed, a wash basin, a window, looking out toward the jagged teeth of the mountains. Eleanor set her travel bag on the floor, but the leather pouch she placed that carefully on the center of the quilt. She sat on the edge of the mattress and unknotted the leather string. The smell hit her first, faint, sweet, dried lavender. Abigail's scent. Eleanor reached in and pulled out the envelopes. 11 of them. The thick parchment felt heavy against her fingertips. She lined them up on the quilt, one by one. The thickest envelope was on the left. In Abigail's sprawling, elegant script, it read simply, Silas. Then came the others, 9 of them. Elias, Rebecca, Matthew, Mark, Hannah, Gideon, Ruth, Mary, Samuel. Every name was written with a different pressure on the pen. You could see where Abigail had paused, thinking of the child, letting the ink pool slightly before finishing the loop of a letter. And then the 11th envelope. It had no name. Just 5 words written across the front, when the time is right. Eleanor stared at the letters. She felt the familiar, heavy ache rise in her throat. She had promised Abigail. Back in that sweltering, dusty room in Kansas, while Abigail's lungs gave out, Eleanor had held her hand and promised. I'll take them to him. Eleanor had sworn. I won't mail them. I'll hand them to him. She planned to walk up that ridge tomorrow, hand the entire stack to Silas Montgomery, explain who she was, turn around, and walk back down. 3 days. That was all it would take to clear her debt to the dead. She didn't know the envelopes held secrets. She didn't know Abigail had written conditions on the inside flaps, instructions meant to be opened across years, not all on a Tuesday afternoon. Eleanor just thought they were goodbyes. She reached out and traced the name Samuel, the baby, the one Abigail hadn't seen grow. A sudden, sharp memory cut through the quiet room. It didn't smell like lavender. It smelled like cigar smoke and polished mahogany. Boston. 2 years ago. The memory was so sharp it physically hurt. Josiah Sterling, sitting in his leather armchair. The doctor standing nervously by the fireplace. The single piece of paper resting on the mahogany desk between them. A barren tree bears no fruit, Eleanor, Josiah had said. His voice was perfectly level, no anger, just cold, absolute dismissal. I refuse to be tethered to a dead branch. This marriage is dissolved. She remembered standing there, listening to a man she had served for 6 years reduce her entire existence to biology, to a doctor's cold ink, Barren. The word had echoed in the courtroom floor. It was printed in the local paper. Society ladies who had once drank tea in her parlor suddenly crossed the street when they saw her coming, because a woman who couldn't birth the child wasn't a woman at all. She was a defect, a broken machine taking up space. She had internalized that word, let it hollow her out. She packed her bags, reclaimed her maiden name, and fled to Kansas. She sought out the sick, the dying, the destitute. If she couldn't create life, she would at least try to comfort those leaving it. That was how she met Abigail Montgomery, and Abigail hadn't seen a barren woman. When Eleanor bathed her feverish skin, when she sang low hymns to ease the coughing fits, Abigail had looked at her with absolute clarity. "You have a mother's hands, Eleanor," Abigail had whispered one night, struggling for air. "Don't let a fool in a suit tell you what you are." Eleanor blinked hard. The Boston parlor faded. The cold Colorado room snapped back into focus. She looked down at her hands. They didn't look broken. They didn't feel barren. They just felt empty. Tomorrow, she would walk up that mountain tomorrow. She would give Silas Montgomery the last pieces of his wife. She would look at his 9 children, deliver their mother's love, and then she would leave, because she had no home to return to. But she firmly believed she didn't belong here either. She gathered the letters, placed them gently back into the leather pouch, tied the string. Outside the window, the wind howled down from the peaks, driving the snow before it. The mountain was waiting, 5 o'clock in the morning, the darkest, coldest part of the day. Up on the ridge, the wind didn't just blow, it scraped. It tore at the shingles of the Montgomery ranch house like it wanted to get inside and finish the job tuberculosis had started. Silas woke before the tin clock on the dresser could ring. He always did. His body didn't rely on gears and springs anymore. It relied on dread, on duty. He threw his legs over the edge of the mattress. The floorboards were freezing. He didn't flinch. He pulled on his canvas trousers, strapped his suspenders, and walked out of the bedroom. The kitchen was empty. It was always empty at this hour now. Abigail used to own 5 o'clock. She used to sit at the scarred oak table, hands wrapped around a tin mug of coffee, watching the sun drag itself over the pines. "This is my time, Silas," she'd say, smiling over the rim. "Before I become everyone else's now." It was just a void, a 30-minute stretch of silence that Silas had to physically push his way through. If he stopped, if he actually listened to that silence, it would deafen him. He didn't stop. He moved. Cold wood, a struck match, the flare of yellow. He got the iron stove burning. He ground the coffee beans, brutal rhythmic motions, chopping, grinding, stirring. Work was the only thing that kept the ghost out of the room. By 6 o'clock, the silence shattered. The house didn't just wake up, it erupted. 9 children crammed into 4 bedrooms. It was a daily avalanche of missing boots, spilled milk, and tangled hair. Elias came down first. 16 years old and walking with a stiffness that didn't belong on a boy. He didn't say good morning. He just grabbed his coat and headed out to the barn to muck the stalls. He was trying to be the man of the house. Silas let him, because Silas was too tired to fight it. Then came the twins, Matthew and Mark, 11 years old, already shoving each other over who got the chair closest to the stove. "Sit down," Silas ordered. His voice wasn't a yell. It was a low rumble, a mountain shifting. The boys sat. Rebecca marched in next, carrying 3-year-old Mary on her hip. Rebecca was 14, but her eyes looked 40. She set the toddler in a chair and started doling out the oatmeal with sharp, rigid movements. She used anger as a shield. If she stayed mad at the world couldn't hurt her anymore. Gideon, 7, knocked over a tin cup of water within 10 seconds of sitting down. Water pooled across the floorboards. "I'll get it," Hannah said quietly, 9 years old, the watcher. She slipped from her chair with a rag, wiping the mess before Gideon could even apologize. "Where's Ma?" Ruth asked, 5 years old. She asked it every morning like her memory reset in her sleep. "Ma's gone, Ruthie," Rebecca snapped, wiping oatmeal off Mary S. chin. "Eat." Silas walked over. He didn't scold Rebecca. He knew she was just bleeding. He knelt beside Ruth. His hands were callous thick from swinging axes and pulling rope, rough hands. But when he reached out and gently tucked a stray blonde curl behind Ruth's ear, his touch was feather-light. "She's resting on the hill, little bird," Silas said softly. "Eat your oats. They keep you warm." Parenting wasn't a biological right. It was this. It was waking up in the freedom of oatmeal. It was answering the same heartbreaking question every single morning and never letting the crack in your own chest show. Silas didn't know how to be a mother, but he knew how to show up. A sharp cry cut through the kitchen from the back bedroom. Samuel, 18 months old. Silas stood up. He walked into the nursery, was still heavy with the memory of sickness. He lifted the baby from the crib. Samuel stopped crying instantly, burying his face in the crook of Silas' neck. Silas closed his eyes. He stood in the dim light, rocking the boy Abigail never really got to know. The boy whose birth had cost her the breath in her lungs. Silas didn't resent the child, he resented himself. By noon, the sun was high, but the air was still sharp. Silas was out by the fence line, swinging an axe, splitting logs. A horse trotted up the trail. Tom Miller, a neighbor from 2 miles down. Tom reined in his gelding and tipped his hat. Silas didn't stop swinging. Thwack, the log split cleanly. Tom, headed into town for supplies, Tom said. He shifted in his saddle. He was a man who liked to talk, which meant Silas usually let him do it all. Saw Beatrice Alden at the mercantile. Said Tatus brought a passenger yesterday. Thwack, a passenger, a woman, from Kansas. The axe stopped in midair. Silas lowered it slowly. He looked at Tom. The woods around them suddenly felt very still. She brought a leather pouch, Tom continued, his voice dropping a little. Beatrice says she holds on to it like it's made of glass. Says she's looking for you. Silas stared at the woodpile. Kansas. Abigail didn't have family in Kansas. She only had the sanatorium, the place she went to get better, the place she died. Much obliged, Tom, Silas said. His voice was completely hollow. Tom nodded, sensing he'd said enough. He spurred his horse and rode on. Silas stood there. The wind bit through his flannel shirt. Someone from Kansas with a pouch. It couldn't be anything else. He didn't finish chopping the wood. He walked to the barn. He saddled his roan gelding in silence. He left Elias in charge of the ranch and rode down the mountain toward Blackwood Pine. He rode hard. The horse kicked up wet snow. But when he reached the edge of town, when the wooden outline of Beatrice S. boarding house came into view, Silas pulled back on the reins. The horse stopped. Silas stared at the second-floor window. There was a light on inside. He sat in the saddle for 15 minutes. The horse blew steam into the freezing air. If the weight held something good, if it held something bad, he needed a night to brace himself. But he knew the truth. It wasn't good or bad. It was Abigail. It was pieces of the woman he loved carried across the plains by a stranger. He wasn't ready. He hadn't been there when she died. He couldn't face her ghost today. Silas turned the horse around. He rode back up the mountain. Late that night, the house was finally dead quiet. Silas sat at the oak table. A kerosene lamp burned low. On the mantel above the fireplace sat a stack of letters, 11 of them. Letters Abigail had sent him from Kansas during her first 6 months there. They were worn soft at the edges from how many times he had read them. Next to them sat 3 other letters, written in his own hand, sealed, unsent. He pulled a blank sheet of paper from a drawer. He took a pen, dipped it in the inkwell. He hadn't written a word in 7 months. Not since she passed. He stared at the blank page, then his hand moved. Someone brought your past home, I'll face it tomorrow. He didn't write anything else. He folded the paper, slipped it into his pocket, and watched the lamp burn out. Tomorrow. Eleanor didn't sleep. The mattress was firm, the blankets were warm, but her mind was 400 miles away in a Kansas sick room. At 6 in the morning, before the sun even cleared the eastern peaks, she gave up trying. She dressed quickly. She pulled on her heavy wool coat, took the leather pouch, and walked downstairs. Beatrice was already in the kitchen, kneading dough. There's a memorial stone on the East Hill, Beatrice said without turning around. She didn't ask where Eleanor was going. She just offered the map. Folks put it up when we got the news. She ain't buried under it, but it's where she's remembered. Thank you, Eleanor said softly. The walk up the East Hill was punishing. The altitude burned in Eleanor's chest. The air was thin and tasted like pine needles and frost. She found the cemetery, a small, fenced-in plot of ground overlooking the valley. In the far corner, standing apart from the older graves, was a fresh granite marker, Abigail Montgomery, 1835-1878. Beloved wife and mother. Eleanor stood before the stone. She didn't cry. You don't cry when a mission isn't finished. She just looked at the words. She never used his name, Eleanor whispered to the cold air. 8 months I sat by her bed. She talked about the children all the time. But when she talked about him, she only ever called him my husband. Like his name was too private to share with a stranger. Eleanor knelt. She touched the cold granite. I brought them, Abigail, just like I promised. She heard the crunch of boots on snow before she saw him. Eleanor stood up and turned. A man was walking up the path. He was tall, broad-shouldered, worn down like a river rock. He wore a heavy canvas coat and a battered Stetson. His face was lined with weather and exhaustion. He didn't slow down when he saw her. He didn't look surprised. This was his Wednesday morning routine, and he wasn't going to surrender his grief to a stranger. He walked right up to the grave. He stood exactly 2 feet away from Eleanor. He didn't take off his hat. He just stared at the stone. They stood there in silence for a full minute. 2 strangers anchored to the same ghost. You knew her, the man said. It wasn't a question. His voice was gravel and wood smoke. I was her nurse in Kansas, Eleanor said. She didn't look at him. She looked at the stone. She asked me to bring her letters back here. I am Silas Montgomery. I know. Another stretch of silence, not an awkward silence. It was the heavy, undeniable silence of a graveyard. You can't pretend here. You can't put on polite society airs in front of the dead. Was she all right? Silas asked. The words seemed to cost him physical pain to push out of his throat. At the end, she was. More peaceful than I expected. Eleanor paused. She thought of you and the children until the very last minute. That's not something a person does if they are in agony. Silas' jaw tightened. She didn't talk much about her family to me, Eleanor continued gently. I knew you had 9 children because she would write their names down. I'd hear her whispering them when she thought I was asleep. She didn't talk much about Kansas to me either, Silas said, his voice flat. Just wrote that she was getting better, and then he stopped. I understand, Eleanor said. She unbuttoned her coat and pulled up the leather pouch. She held it out to him. This is what she left for you, for all of you. Silas looked at the pouch. He didn't want to take it. He wanted to turn around and walk back down the hill, but he reached out. His large, rough hand brushed against her gloved fingers. He took the pouch. He undid the string. He looked inside. He saw the familiar, elegant handwriting on the thick envelopes. How many? He asked. 11. 1 for you, 1 for each of the children, and Eleanor paused. 1 she didn't address to anyone. Silas pulled out the thickest envelope, the one with his name on it. He stared at it for a long time. Then his thumb slid under the seal. He tore it open. He didn't read the whole thing. His eyes just scanned the first few lines. Eleanor watched his face change. The stoic, unmovable mountain of a man seemed to crack right down the middle. His breathing hitched. He folded the letter quickly, almost violently, and shoved it into his coat pocket. When he looked back up at Eleanor, his eyes were devastatingly bleak. I have letters too, Silas said. His voice was a bare whisper. Eleanor frowned. What? I have 3 letters I wrote her, from November to January. He looked away, staring out over the pine trees. I never sent them. Eleanor felt the breath leave her lungs. You didn't send them, she asked. I wrote them, but I kept them, for a reason I haven't told a single soul. Eleanor stared at him. The puzzle pieces in her mind violently rearranged themselves. She kept them too, Eleanor said softly. The realization hit her like a physical blow. These 11 letters, she didn't mail them. She wrote them and she locked them in a drawer. I found them after she passed. They stood there in the snow. The truth hung between them, heavy and tragic. Twist. For the last 2 months of Abigail's life, they had both stopped sending letters. Silas had stopped. Abigail had stopped. They had both retreated into silence. They both locked their words in drawers, thinking they were protecting the other. They thought they were doing the right thing. And because of that silence, they had both died a little bit alone. Educational value, unspoken but screaming in the frosty air. Silence isn't a shield. When you build a wall to protect someone from your pain, you just end up trapping them outside in the cold. Silas looked at the ground. He looked like a man who had just been sentenced to hang. Then, he cleared his throat. He pulled his hat down a fraction of an inch. Have you eaten? He asked. Eleanor blinked. The pivot was so jarring she almost didn't register the question. No. Beatrice makes a good breakfast. I usually eat there on Wednesdays. It wasn't a romantic invitation. It wasn't polite hospitality. It was the desperate request of a man who realized he was holding a bomb in his coat pocket and didn't want to sit in a room by himself when it went off. He needed to be near the woman who knew the other half of the silence. Eleanor looked at Abigail's gravestone. Then she looked at Silas. They walked down the hill toward the town. They didn't walk side by side. Silas walked half a step ahead. Eleanor walked half a step behind. It was the exact distance between 2 people who didn't know each other at all but who were no longer strangers. The diner at Beatrice Alden's boarding house smelled of bacon grease and strong coffee. It was a good smell, honest. Silas and Eleanor sat in the corner booth. The leather pouch rested on the scarred wooden table between them. Neither of them reached for it. It felt like a third person sitting with them, taking up all the air in the room. Silas stared at his coffee mug. He hadn't touched it. Eleanor watched him. She saw a man holding himself together by sheer willpower. The revelation on the hill had stripped away his armor. They had both failed Abigail. They had both chosen silence. The weight of that shared guilt tied them together faster than any conversation could. The bell above the diner door jingled. A man walked in. He was tall, thin as a rail, dressed in a faded black suit. His hair was stark white, swept back from a face carved by high-altitude winds and decades of listening to other people, says Sin's Reverend Amos Thorne. He didn't stop at the counter. He didn't order coffee. He walked straight to the corner booth. He pulled out a chair, its wooden legs scraping loud against the floorboards, and sat down directly across from them. He didn't look at Silas. He looked at the woman in the gray wool coat. Eleanor Vance, Amos said. Eleanor froze. Her hand stopped halfway to her cup. She had never been to Colorado in her life. She hadn't given her last name to Beatrice yet. Silas looked up, his brow furrowing. Amos, how do you know her name? Amos folded his long, bony hands on the table. He had eyes that didn't judge but didn't let you hide either. I know her name because Abigail wrote it down, Amos said quietly. Every week for the last 6 months. Silas went perfectly still. Abigail wrote to you. She did, Silas, from the sanatorium in Kansas. Amos didn't offer an apology. He stated it like a fact of nature. She found my address in the back of her Bible. She wrote to me about her health, about her fears, and mostly about the woman sitting next to you. Eleanor felt the breath leave her lungs. She told you I was coming. She prayed you were coming, Amos corrected. She told me you were a woman who kept her promises, even the hard ones. Silas looked at the pouch, then at the preacher. Why did she write to you? Why not me? Amos turned to Silas. The old preacher's face softened. Because you were drowning, son. She knew you were keeping that ranch alive by the skin of your teeth. She knew you were trying to protect her from your exhaustion. She didn't want to burden you with her dying thoughts. So, she gave them to me. Amos turned back to Eleanor. Abigail told me about the nights you sat up with her, Amos said. She told me how you combed her hair, how you read to her. She said you were the first person in 2 years to look at her like a human being instead of a tragedy waiting to happen. Eleanor looked down. Her throat tightened. She was my friend. I just did what anyone would do. No, you didn't. Amos leaned forward. The diner around them seemed to fall away. The clatter of forks and low chatter faded. This was the moment. The preacher wasn't going to offer a soft prayer. He was going to perform a surgery. Abigail told me your story, Eleanor. She told me about Boston, about the husband who threw you away, about doctor's note. Eleanor flinched. The word Barren screamed in her head. She wanted to stand up. She wanted to run. Amos reached out and tapped the wooden table with one knobby finger. Hard. Listen to me, Amos commanded. The authority in his voice anchored her to the chair. Society likes to print labels. It makes it easy to sort people, easy to throw them away. Men like your former husband build their pride on what a woman can produce for them. He let the words hang in the air. But the Lord didn't build a woman just to be an incubator, Amos said, his voice dropping to a fierce, steady rumble. He built you with a heart, with hands, with a mind. Your worth wasn't stripped away in a Boston parlor. Your worth is in the hands that bathed a dying woman. Your worth is in the courage it took to ride a stagecoach 400 miles to deliver peace to a broken family. A doctor's ink doesn't decide if you are barren. Love does, and Abigail knew you were overflowing with it. Eleanor closed her eyes. A single tear broke free, tracking hot down her cheek. It was the first time in 2 years someone had taken the label, held it up to the light, and called it a lie. It wasn't pity, it was justice. Silas sat beside her, utterly silent. He didn't interrupt. He was listening just as hard as she was. He looked at Eleanor. He didn't see a broken woman. He saw the woman who had carried his wife's soul across the plains. Amos stood up. He patted the table. You have a job to do today, Eleanor, the preacher said. Take those letters up the mountain. Deliver them, and when you're done, remember what I said. He turned and walked out of the diner. The ride up to the Montgomery ranch took an hour in a rented wagon. Silas rode his horse alongside her. They didn't speak. When the wagon crested the ridge, Eleanor saw it. The ranch wasn't grand. It was raw. Pine logs, smoking chimneys, sprawling corrals. It looked like it had been carved out of the wilderness by bare hands. And there were the children. They stood on the porch, 9 of them, ranging from a tall, scowling boy down to a toddler clutching an older girl's skirt. They watched the wagon pull up with guarded, untrusting eyes. Eleanor stepped down. She held the leather pouch. It felt heavier now. Silas dismounted. He didn't make a grand introduction. He just stood by the porch steps. This is Miss Eleanor, Silas said to his children. She came from Kansas. She brought something from your mother. No one moved. Eleanor walked up the steps. She felt the weight of 9 stairs. She didn't offer a fake smile. She didn't use a high, sweet voice. Kids didn't respect fake. They smelled it like blood in the water. She opened the pouch. Elias, she said softly. The oldest boy stepped forward. He had Silas's jaw and his mother's eyes. Eleanor handed him the envelope. He took it, gave a stiff nod, and immediately walked off toward the barn. He wasn't going to let a stranger see him break. Rebecca, the 14-year-old girl, didn't move. Her arms were crossed tight. I don't want it. Eleanor didn't push. She didn't offer a lecture. She just placed the letter gently on the porch railing. It will be here when you're ready. She handed the next to Matthew, then Mark. The twins took them silently. Hannah, the 9-year-old, stepped up. She took the envelope, looked at her mother's handwriting, and then looked up at Eleanor. Did she hurt at the end? No, sweetheart, Eleanor said honestly. She was asleep. Hannah nodded. A small, solemn acceptance. She folded the letter into her apron. She gave Gideon his, then Ruth, then Mary. Finally, she held the smallest envelope, Samuel. Silas stepped forward. He took the baby from Rebecca's hip. He reached out with his free hand and Eleanor placed the tiny envelope into his palm. The porch was silent. The wind moved through the pines. Eleanor looked at the children. She looked at Silas holding the baby. She had done it. The delivery was made. Her 3-day promise was fulfilled. She could turn around, get in the wagon, and leave. But as she looked at Rebecca staring at the letter on the railing and Hannah tracing the ink on her envelope, Eleanor knew the truth. 3 days wasn't going to be enough. Day 4. The morning sun hit the frost on the boarding house window. Eleanor was still there. She walked downstairs to the diner. Her travel bag was still unpacked in her room. When she sat at the counter, Beatrice didn't ask a single question. The older woman simply slid a plate of eggs and ham in front of her, set down a mug coffee, and went back to washing dishes. It was an unspoken contract. You don't announce you're staying. You just don't leave. By mid-morning, Eleanor found herself walking the 4 miles up the ridge to the ranch. She didn't have a plan. She just knew that a house with 9 grieving children and a drowning man needed hands. When she arrived, Silas wasn't in the yard. Elias was out riding the fence line. The younger kids were scattered around the dirt yard near the barn. It was chaotic, loud. Eleanor stood by the gate, watching. She didn't want to intrude. She was an outsider. Then it happened. Gideon, the 7-year-old with too much energy and too little fear, was balancing on the top rail of the horse corral. He slipped. He's gonna just fall. He caught his arm on a rusted, jagged nail sticking out of the post. He hit the dirt with a sickening thud. For one second, there was total silence. Then Gideon screamed. Rebecca rushed out of the house. She saw the blood. It was bright red, pumping fast from a gash on his forearm. Rebecca froze. Her eyes went wide. She was 14 years old, playing mother to 8 siblings. And in that moment, the weight of the world crushed her. She stood perfectly still, her hands hovering in the air, hyperventilating. "Gideon!" Hannah cried out, but she was too small to lift him. Eleanor didn't think. The Kansas sickroom instincts fired. She vaulted the wooden gate. Her heavy wool skirt caught on the wood, tearing, but she didn't care. She hit the dirt running. "Rebecca, look at me!" Eleanor barked. Her voice wasn't soft. It was the sharp, commanding crack of a field nurse. Rebecca snapped her head up. "Go to the pump. Bring me a bucket of clean water. Now run!" The command broke the girl's paralysis. Rebecca turned and sprinted for the well. Eleanor dropped to her knees in the dirt beside Gideon. The boy was thrashing, screaming in panic at the sight of his own blood. "Gideon, look right here," Eleanor said. She grabbed his face with her clean hand, forcing him to meet her eyes. "Look at—"
He whimpered, terrified.
"I've got you," she said. Her voice dropped to a low, rhythmic hum. "I've got you. It looks worse than it is. We are going to fix it." Without hesitation, Eleanor grabbed the hem of her clean white cotton petticoat beneath her skirt. She gripped it and ripped a long, wide strip of fabric free. She wrapped it tight above the gash, applying hard, unforgiving pressure to stop the bleeding. Gideon screamed at the pain of the pressure. "I know," Eleanor said softly, not loosening her grip. "I know it bites, but the bite means it's working." Rebecca arrived with the bucket. She was shaking. "Pour it over the cut," Eleanor ordered. Steady. The cold water washed away the mud and the excess blood. The cut was deep, but it hadn't hit the artery. It was a flesh wound. Eleanor exhaled a short breath of relief. She quickly bound the arm tightly with the rest of the torn petticoat, tying a clean, professional knot. Gideon was sobbing, shaking from the adrenaline. Eleanor didn't tell him to be a man. She didn't tell him to stop crying. She just gathered the dusty, bloody 7-year-old into her arms, pulled him into her lap right there in the dirt, and rocked him. She started to sing. It wasn't a lullaby. It was an old Methodist hymn. Slow, rhythmic, deep. Her voice vibrated against his chest. Slowly, the boy's thrashing stopped. His breathing matched the rhythm of her song. He buried his wet face into her ruined wool coat. Eleanor looked up. Rebecca was standing a few feet away. The hostility that usually masked the girl's face was completely gone. In its place was something raw, something hungry. Rebecca was looking at Eleanor not as an intruder, but as a lifeline. Neither of them realized Silas had ridden into the yard. He sat on his horse, 10 yards away. He had seen the whole thing. He saw the blood, he saw his daughter freeze, and he saw the woman from Kansas tear her own clothes to save his son, sitting in the mud, rocking him until the fear went away. Silas didn't ride over. He didn't say thank you. Words were too small for what he just watched. He tipped his hat just a fraction of an inch and rode toward the barn. The implicit lesson hung in the crisp mountain air. Motherhood isn't birthed in a delivery room. It is forged in the dirt. It is the instinct to bleed your own hands to stop a child from bleeding. It is the choice to step into the chaos when everyone else freezes. By 3 o'clock, the crisis had passed. Gideon was sitting on the porch, his arm neatly bandaged, eating a piece of hard candy Eleanor had found in her pocket. Silas was out by the barn. The winter snows had rotted a section of the roof. He had a ladder propped against the side. He was standing on the second rung, trying to hold a heavy pine plank in place while reaching for his hammer. It was a two-man job. He was doing it alone. Eleanor walked across the yard. She didn't ask if he needed help. Asking implies the other person is failing. She walked up to the base of the ladder. She picked up the tin box of iron nails. She grabbed the spare hammer lying in the grass. Silas looked down at her. Eleanor didn't smile. She just pulled a nail from the box, held it up, and waited. Silas looked at the nail. Then he looked at the woman. Her coat was stained with his son's blood. Her skirt was torn. There was a streak of dirt across her cheek. She looked nothing like the fragile, proper ladies of Boston. She looked beautiful. Silas reached down and took the nail. For the next 2 hours, they didn't speak a dozen words. They didn't need to. They fell into a rhythm. He lifted the wood. She handed the nail. He drove it in. She anticipated the next angle. Clack, clack, clack. The sound of the hammer echoing off the mountains. It was the rhythm of shared labor. In the West, you don't earn respect through polite conversation in a parlor. You earn it by carrying your end of the log, by standing in the wind and doing the work without complaining. When the sun began to dip below the ridge, Silas climbed down the ladder. He wiped the sweat from his forehead with the back of his canvas sleeve. He looked at the repaired roof. Then he looked at Eleanor. "You know how to hold a line," Silas said. It was the highest compliment a mountain man could give. It meant you were steady. It meant you didn't break when the weight shifted. "I know how to work, Silas," Eleanor said simply. "I see that." He paused. He looked toward the house, where Gideon was laughing at something the twins did. "You didn't have to stay. I know. My kids, they're rough. They're angry. They're grieving," Eleanor corrected him. "Anger is just grief that hasn't found a place to sit down yet." Silas stared at her. The truth of that statement hit him squarely in the chest. He had been so busy surviving. He hadn't let them grieve. He hadn't let himself grieve. He reached out. His thick, calloused fingers gently brushed the dirt smudge from her cheek. The touch was electric, shocking in its tenderness. "Oh," Silas said, his voice dropping. "I have to fix the south fence. Elias is going to town. I'll be alone." He wasn't asking for help. He was leaving a door open. Eleanor looked up into his eyes. "I'll be here," she said. They stood there in the fading light. No promises, no grand declarations. Just two people agreeing to build something, one nail at a time. The house was finally asleep. It was a restless kind of sleep. Timbers groaning. Wind rattling the glass. Silas sat alone at the kitchen table. The kerosene lamp hissed, throwing long, flickering shadows against the log walls. He had the thick envelope in his hands. His name was written across the front, Silas. Just his name. It was Abigail's handwriting. But the ink was lighter in some places, heavier in others, like it had taken her a few tries to get the word out. He slid his thumb under the seal. The paper tore with a dry, harsh sound. He unfolded the letter. 3 pages. The paper was thin, smelling faintly of lavender and medicine. He took a breath. He started to read. "My dearest Silas, if you are reading this, the winter is over. For me, at least. I know you. I know you are sitting at that heavy oak table right now, running your thumb over the wood grain, blaming yourself. Stop it. You didn't fail me because you didn't ride to Kansas. You saved me by staying. I spent my days here watching the plains. They are flat empty. They don't hold a candle to our mountains. But it gave me time to think, and to see clearly. You were enough, Silas. Do you hear me? You were always enough. Not perfect. You hold on to your silence like it is a shield, and sometimes you drove me half mad with it. But you were enough. That is a rare thing in a man. I am sending these letters home with someone. A woman." Silas paused. He traced the words. "A woman. She has been my nurse, but more than that, she has been my friend. I am not writing her name down here. I don't want you building a picture of her in your head before you meet her. I don't want you looking at her and seeing the woman who watched my wife die. I want you to see her as she is. She is good, Silas, and she is walking around with a wound she doesn't think anyone can see. Be kind to her. Let her rest. Forever yours, Abigail." Silas lowered the paper. The grief was too old and too deep for tears. It was a physical ache in his ribs. But underneath the ache, something else shifted. Abigail had done this on purpose. She hadn't just forgotten to name Eleanor. She had deliberately left it out. She had orchestrated this meeting from a deathbed 400 miles away, wiping the slate clean so Silas and Eleanor would have to look at each other as people, not as obligations, not as ghosts. The next morning the sky was the color of bruised iron. Eleanor was at the ranch early. She had brought a basket of fresh bread from Beatrice's kitchen. She didn't announce herself. She just walked into the house, set the bread on the table, and started slicing. Silas came in from the cold. He took off his hat and beat the dust against his leg. He looked at her. "You're here early," he said. "The boys need to eat before they cut wood," Eleanor said. She didn't look up from the loaf. "And you need to eat before you fix that south fence?" Silas walked over to the table. He stood close enough that she could smell the pine resin and frost on his coat. "She didn't write your name down," Silas said quietly. Eleanor's hand stopped. The knife rested in the bread. She looked up at him. "In your letter? She just called you a woman?" Said. "She wanted us to meet without me having a picture in my head." "Amos told me," Eleanor murmured. "He said she wanted us to meet as blank slates." "It's hard to be a blank slate," Silas said, his voice dropping, "when you're carrying the past around in a leather pouch." Eleanor looked away. She stared at the grain of the wood table. The memory of Boston was crawling up the back of her neck, the cold courtroom, the doctor's note. "My slate isn't blank, Silas," Eleanor said. Her voice was brittle. She was tired of hiding it. If she was going to be in this house, standing in this kitchen, she wouldn't do it under false pretenses. "You read the letter. Abigail said I have a wound. I read it." Eleanor took a ragged breath. She let go of the knife. "I was married before, in Boston, for 6 years. She didn't look at him. If she looked at him, she might break. We had a big house. We had money. We had everything, except the one thing my husband wanted." Silas didn't speak. He just listened. The silence he offered wasn't empty. It was a space made for her to step into. "6 years. Nothing," Eleanor continued, the words tumbling out like stones from a broken sack. "He took me to a specialist. The doctor ran tests. Then he handed my husband a piece of paper. It said I was barren. The word hung in the kitchen. It sounded ugly, harsh. He divorced me," Eleanor whispered. "Publicly, he told the judge I was a dead branch, that I couldn't fulfill my duty as a woman. I was a broken thing, so I packed my bags and I ran." She finally forced herself to look up. She braced herself for the pity. She expected to see Silas looking at her the way the men in Boston had, like a tragic, defective creature. Silas wasn't looking at her with pity. His jaw was clenched so tight the muscle fluttered. His eyes were dark, burning with a quiet, terrifying anger. But the anger wasn't directed at her. Silas stepped closer. He reached out and took the knife from the breadboard. He set it down on the table with a hard clack. "Barren," Silas said. The way he chewed on the word made it sound like poison. He looked Eleanor dead in the eyes. "The man who called you that was a fool," Silas said. His voice was a low, vibrating rumble, a blind, arrogant fool. He didn't know the difference between dead earth and unplanted soil. Eleanor's breath hitched. "Listen to me," Silas commanded, leaning in. The intensity in his face pinned her to the spot. "I've been working land my whole life. You can have the richest soil in the world, but if the farmer is too weak to tend it, nothing grows. That doesn't mean the dirt is bad. It means the man failed the land." He pointed a thick, calloused finger toward the window, toward the yard where Gideon was laughing with Hannah. "I saw you yesterday," Silas said. "I saw you tear your own clothes to stop my boy from bleeding. I saw you pull him into the dirt and sing until a hair tear broke. Do you think I care what a doctor's ink says?" Eleanor felt a tear slip down her cheek. She didn't wipe it away. "Biology is blood, Eleanor," Silas said softly. The anger drained out of his voice, leaving only an absolute, unbreakable truth. "It's just blood. It's an accident of nature. But being a mother, that is a choice. It is a choice you make every damn day when you wake up in the dark and decide to love someone else more than yourself." He reached out. His thumb caught the tear on her cheek. "You aren't a dead branch," Silas whispered. "You just haven't found the right place to put down roots." Eleanor closed her eyes. The heavy, suffocating iron box she had carried for 2 years cracked wide open. She didn't collapse. She stood taller. The poison of the word barren was draining out of her, washed away by the mountain truth of the man standing in front of her. "Thank you," she breathed. "Don't thank me for the truth," Silas said. He picked up his hat. "I'm going to fix the fence." He walked out the door. Eleanor stood in the kitchen, feeling the warmth of the stove. For the first time in years, she felt like she could take a full breath. The storm didn't give a warning. In Colorado, spring blizzards don't drift in, they drop. One minute the sky was a pale, icy blue, and the next it turned the color of a bruised plum. Then the wind hit. Eleanor was in the barn with Elias, helping him mend a saddle strap when the temperature plummeted 20 degrees in 10 minutes. The barn door slammed shut with force of a cannon. "Whites out!" Elias yelled over the howling wind. He shoved the wooden bolt across the barn doors. "We gotta get to the house. Hold on to the rope." Silas had strung a thick hemp rope from the barn to the back porch for days exactly like this. Elias grabbed it. Eleanor took hold right behind him. They stepped out of the barn. It was like walking into a wall of ground glass. The snow was horizontal, blinding, and viciously cold. By the time they stumbled onto the back porch and Silas hauled them inside, Eleanor was shivering uncontrollably. "You're not going back to town tonight," Silas said, slamming the heavy oak door and throwing the iron latch. "Road's gone. Town's gone. We're trapped here until it blows over." Eleanor nodded, her teeth chattering. Rebecca appeared with a thick wool blanket and wrapped it around her shoulders without a word. It was a small gesture, but from Rebecca it was a surrender. Night fell fast. It was a claustrophobic, heavy darkness, held back only by the roaring fire in the stone hearth. By 9 o'clock, the younger children were asleep. Elias and Rebecca had retreated to their rooms, exhausted by the tension of the storm. The house was quiet, save for the wind shrieking against the logs. Eleanor sat in the rocking chair by the fire. She had a mug of hot cider in her hands. She was staring at the flames, listening to the storm, feeling completely isolated from the rest of the world. And yet, for the first time in a long time, she didn't feel lonely. Silas walked into the room. He wasn't wearing his coat, just his suspenders and a faded flannel shirt. He carried a small, rough-hewn wooden cedar box. He sat down heavily on the stone hearth, facing the fire, resting the box on his knees. He stared at the wood for a long time. The flames threw orange light across the deep lines of his face. "You said you found her letters locked in a drawer," Silas said quietly. The wind outside almost drowned him out. But Eleanor heard him. "I did." She kept the key under her pillow. Silas ran his hand over the lid of the cedar box. He unlatched the brass hook. He opened it. Inside were 3 envelopes. The paper was clean, untouched by the journey. "I wrote these in November, December, and January," Silas said. He pulled the top letter out. He didn't open it, he just held it. "I sat at that table over there every Sunday night, and I wrote to my wife." "But you didn't mail them," Eleanor said gently. "No." "Why?" Silas closed his eyes. The pain on his face was raw and exposed. "Because I was a coward," Eleanor frowned. "You aren't a coward, Silas. I am." He opened his eyes and looked at the fire. In the last 2 months, her letters started to change. They got shorter. Her handwriting got weaker. She stopped talking about coming home and started talking about how to manage the winter without her. Silas swallowed hard. "I knew she was dying, and she knew she was dying, but neither of us would say the words. We were playing a game, a terrible, silent game." He tapped the envelope against his knee. In these letters, I didn't ask her how the weather was," Silas said, his voice dropping to a rough, broken whisper. "I didn't tell her about the cattle. I asked her one question. The only question that was keeping me awake at night." He looked up at Eleanor. The vulnerability in the mountain man's eyes was breathtaking. "I asked her, 'Do you resent me?'" Silas said. "Do you resent me for staying here with the ranch? Do you hate me for letting you die in a strange bed 400 miles from your family?" Eleanor felt her heart twist in her chest. "I wrote the question down," Silas said bitterly, "but I couldn't put the letter in the mail, because I was terrified that if she read it, she would answer, and I didn't think I could survive it if she said yes." He stared at the envelopes. His shoulders slumped. "So I chose silence. I let her die thinking I didn't have anything left to say. I thought I was protecting her, but I was just protecting myself." Eleanor sat frozen in the rocking chair. The implicit lesson of the story was ringing like a bell in the quiet room. Silence. It was the weapon people used when they thought they were being kind, not realizing it was a blade that cut both ways. Eleanor set her cider down on the floorboards. She stood up, wrapped the wool blanket tighter around her shoulders, and walked over to the hearth. She sat down on the stone beside him. She looked at the fire. "When Josiah handed me that doctor's note," Eleanor said softly, "he talked for 20 minutes. He talked about legacy, about his family name, about what society expected of a man in his position." Silas turned his head to look at her. "I didn't say a word," Eleanor confessed. "I just sat there and let him talk, let him dismantle my life." She turned to meet Silas's gaze. "I had a question too," she whispered. "A question I wanted to scream at him. I wanted to ask, do you hate me because I'm broken, or do you hate me because I'm proof that you can't buy everything you want?" Silas' eyes locked onto hers. "But I never asked it," Eleanor said, a tear slipping down her face. "Because I was terrified of the answer too. I chose the silence. We suffered in a quiet house for 2 years because neither of us had the courage to tell the truth. We just let the silence rot us from the inside out." She reached out. Her small, pale hand rested over his large, rough one, covering the unsent letters. "You didn't fail her, Silas," Eleanor said fiercely. "You loved her, and love is terrifying. It makes cowards of us all sometimes. But Abigail didn't resent you. I was there. She loved you with every breath she had left." Silas looked at her hand resting on his. He let out a long, shuddering breath. It was the sound of a man setting down a burden he had been carrying up a mountain for months. He turned his hand over and, sailing his finger through hers, a simple, desperate connection in the dark. A floorboard creaked in the hallway. Eleanor and Silas looked up. Elias was standing in the shadows of the archway. He was wearing his long johns, holding a candle. He had come down for water, but he had stopped. He had heard. Elias didn't look away. He didn't look embarrassed. He looked at Silas holding Eleanor's hand. The 16-year-old boy stepped fully into the light of the fire. He looked at Eleanor. "My ma didn't write about people she didn't respect," Elias said. His voice was cracking, stuck halfway between boy and man. "She respected you, Miss Eleanor. She wrote a lot about you, from the very beginning?" Eleanor felt a fresh wave of tears hit her eyes. Thank you, Elias. Elias nodded once. He looked at his father. Fire needs more wood, Pa. Don't let it go out. I won't, son, Silas said softly. Elias turned and walked back up the stairs. Silas and Eleanor sat by the hearth while the blizzard raged outside. They didn't let go of each other's hands. The silence in the room wasn't heavy anymore. It was warm. It was the silence of two people who had finally spoken the truth and found that it didn't destroy them after all. The morning after the blizzard broke blinding and white. The storm had blown itself out by dawn, leaving the mountain buried under 2 feet of fresh snow. The air was dead still, the kind of quiet that rings in your ears. Inside the ranch house, the fire had burned down to glowing red embers. Eleanor was in the kitchen boiling water for oats. Silas was out back shoveling a path to the barn. The younger children were still asleep. Rebecca was awake. She walked into the main room to sweep the floorboards. She moved with that stiff, angry energy she always carried. She swept past the stone hearth, and she stopped. Silas had left the cedar box on the mantel. He hadn't hidden it. He hadn't locked it. After the emotional exhaustion of the night before, he had just set it down and gone to sleep. Rebecca stared at the box. She knew it. It was where her father kept his important papers, the deed to the land, the livestock receipts, but the lid was unlatched. She reached out. She opened it. She saw the 3 envelopes sitting on top. She saw her mother's name written on them in her father's heavy, block handwriting. Abigail Montgomery. Rebecca picked the top one up. She looked at the date inked in the corner, November 14th. She picked up the next, December 10th. The last one, January 4th. Just weeks before Abigail died. None of them had postage stamps. None of them had been opened. Eleanor stepped out of the kitchen, wiping her hands on an apron. She saw Rebecca standing by the hearth, holding the letters. Eleanor's stomach dropped. Rebecca, Eleanor said softly, put those back. Rebecca didn't hear her. The 14-year-old girl was staring at the dates. Her hands began to shake. The paper rattled in her grip. Silas walked through the front door, stamping snow off his boots. He carried an armful of split firewood. He stopped dead in the entryway. He saw his daughter holding the letters. The wood hit the floor with a loud, clattering crash. Rebecca, Silas said. His voice was a low warning. Rebecca whipped her head around. Her face was paper white. Her eyes were wide, filling with a frantic, wild kind of rage. You didn't send them, Rebecca said. Her voice shook. These are from November, December, when she was getting worse. Silas didn't move. He stood in the doorway, the cold air rushing in behind him. Put the letters down, Becca. She was waiting for them, Rebecca screamed. The sounds tore through the quiet house. It wasn't just anger. It was the absolute agony of a child realizing a parent had failed. I remember, she wrote us in October saying she checked the mail every day. She checked every day, and you stopped writing to her. Rebecca, please. Eleanor stepped forward, reaching out. Don't touch me. Rebecca spun away, backing up against the stone fireplace. She glared at her father. Tears spilled over her eyelashes, hot and fast. You left her alone. You put her on that train to Kansas, and then you just forgot about her. You let her die thinking we didn't care. That is not true, Silas said. His voice was remarkably level, but the muscle in his jaw was ticking. It is true, Rebecca sobbed, holding the letters up like evidence in a trial. Look at them. You wrote them and you kept them. Why? Were you too busy? Were you too tired? Rebecca, stop! Elias's voice came from the stairs. The 16-year-old boy stood on the landing, his face pale. The younger kids were peeking out from behind his legs, terrified by the screaming. No! Rebecca yelled, her voice breaking. She stared at Silas with absolute, unfiltered hatred. You abandoned her. You gave up on her before she was even dead. Silas took it. He stood there in his snow-covered boots. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't defend himself. He let his 14-year-old daughter hurl all her grief and rage right at his chest. He took the blows because he thought he deserved them. Eleanor couldn't bear it. She knew the question in those letters. She knew Silas was paralyzed by his own fear. But she also knew something else. She knew he wasn't a monster. Silas, Eleanor pleaded softly. Tell her. Silas closed his eyes. The breath he took was ragged. It sounded like a man pulling a knife out of his own ribs. He opened his eyes. He looked at his daughter. Put the letters down, Becca, Silas said. His voice wasn't angry anymore. It was completely shattered. And I will tell you why I didn't mail them. Rebecca hesitated. Her chest heaved. Slowly, she lowered the letters to the mantel. Silas walked into the room. He didn't stand over her. He walked to the heavy oak table and sat down. He looked older in that moment than Eleanor had ever seen him. It was November. Silas started. The room was dead silent. Even the wind outside had stopped. You kids had gone down to Beatrice for the week. The roads were freezing over. I kept Samuel here with me. He was teething, fussing a lot. I thought it was just the cold. Rebecca stood by the fireplace, her arms crossed tight defensively. It wasn't the cold, Silas said, staring at the grain of the wood table. It was lung fever. Rebecca's breath hitched. It hit him fast. One afternoon he was crying, and by midnight he was burning up. He couldn't draw a breath without his chest rattling. Silas swallowed hard. He looked up, looking past Rebecca into the memory. The doctor in town was snowed in. I couldn't get down the ridge. It was just me and the boy. Eleanor felt a cold chill run down her spine. A baby with lung fever in an isolated cabin. It was a death sentence. I sat in that rocking chair. Silas pointed to the hearth. For 18 nights, I kept the fire so hot the chimney nearly cracked. I held him upright against my chest so the fluid wouldn't drown him. I didn't sleep for more than 10 minutes at a time. I just sat there, listening to him fight for every single breath. Silas looked back down at his hands. They were trembling slightly. It was the same week I was supposed to write your mother, Silas said. His voice was a hollow whisper. I sat down with the pen and I couldn't do it. He looked up at Rebecca. His eyes were bloodshot, desperate. What was I supposed to write to her, Becca? Silas asked, the tears finally breaking in his voice. She was 400 miles away, dying of a disease in her lungs. Was I supposed to write her a letter and tell her that her baby boy was suffocating in my arms? Was I supposed to tell her that Samuel was dying too? Rebecca froze. The anger drained out of her face instantly, leaving only shock. If I told her the truth, the worry would have killed her that very night, Silas said. And if I lied to her, if I wrote about the snow and the cattle while my son was turning blue on my chest, I wouldn't have been able to live with myself. He leaned his elbows on the table and put his face in his hands. So I didn't write. Silas wept into his palms. The sound of this giant, unmovable mountain of a man breaking down was devastating. I chose the silence. I sat in that chair and I fought for the boy, and I let my wife think I forgot her. It was the only way I knew how to protect her. The room was perfectly still. The implicit lesson struck like lightning in the quiet cabin. Silence wasn't always cowardice. Sometimes silence was the heaviest, bloodiest cross a person could bear. Silas had sacrificed his own reputation in his wife's eyes and his daughter's eyes to spare Abigail the ultimate despair. Rebecca let out a choked sob. She walked across the room. She didn't look angry anymore. She looked like a little girl who realized her father was bleeding out. She wrapped her arms around Silas' neck from behind. She buried her face in his shoulder, crying uncontrollably. Silas reached up. His large, rough hand grabbed hers. He held onto her like a drowning man. Elias walked down the stairs, tears streaming down his own face, and put his hand on his father's back. Eleanor stood in the kitchen doorway. She watched them, this broken, messy, fiercely loving family. They weren't perfect. They made terrible mistakes out of love, but they held each other when the truth finally came out. She pressed her hand to her chest. She realized with absolute certainty that she loved them. All of them. Day 12. The snow had melted enough to turn the yard into a thick, muddy soup. The sun was shining. The air smelled like wet pine and thawing earth. Eleanor was standing on the back porch, hanging wet laundry on a stretched line. She had been here 12 days, 9 days past her promise. She hadn't packed her bag at the boarding house. She hadn't bought a return ticket on the stagecoach. Every morning she woke up, walked the 4 miles up the ridge, and went to work. She cooked, she cleaned. She sat with Hannah and read. She chased Gideon. And every evening Silas walked her back down the ridge. They talked about the weather, the ranch, the kids. They didn't talk about Boston or Kansas. They were just learning the shape of each other. A black buggy splashed up the muddy trail toward the ranch. Eleanor paused, holding a wet sheet. It was Reverend Amos. He pulled back on the reins, halting the horse by the porch. He didn't look like a man making a casual social call. He looked solemn. Silas stepped out of the barn holding a pitchfork. He saw the preacher and walked over. "Morning, Amos," Silas said. "Roads are a mess." "They are," Amos agreed. He tied off the reins and stepped down into the mud. He looked at Silas, then he looked at Eleanor on the porch. "I need to speak with you both," inside. They gathered around the heavy oak table in the kitchen. Amos reached inside his black coat. He pulled out a leather-bound journal. He opened it, reached into the back pocket, and pulled out an envelope. It was thick parchment, smelling faintly of lavender. Eleanor's breath hitched. She recognized the paper immediately. "I thought I brought all of them," Eleanor whispered. "You brought the ones she wanted you to carry," Amos said gently. He placed the envelope on the table. It was face down. "Abigail sent this to me 3 months before she died," Amos explained. He looked at Silas. "She sent it with strict instructions. A condition, really." "What condition?" Silas asked. His eyes were fixed on the envelope. Amos turned his gaze to Eleanor. "She told me to hold on to this letter," the preacher said. "She told me that you, Eleanor, would arrive in Blackwood Pine. She knew you would keep your promise to deliver the pouch." Eleanor nodded slowly. "But," Amos continued, raising a finger, "she told me I was only allowed to give you this letter if you stayed past 3 days. The room went completely quiet. 3 days, Eleanor repeated. Her mind spun. "Abigail knew you," Amos said. His voice was rich, filled with a deep pastoral warmth. She knew you were dutiful. She knew you would drop the letters off, feel like an intruder, and try to run away. She knew you'd give yourself a deadline to leave. Silas looked at Eleanor. He remembered that first morning by the grave she had said. Abigail told me, Amos said softly, that if you stayed past 3 days, it meant you weren't just running an errand anymore. It meant you had found a reason to stay. It meant you chose this place, and only then were you ready to hear what she had to say. Amos slid the envelope across the wood. It stopped right in front of Eleanor. She looked down. Written across the front in Abigail's beautiful, sweeping script was her name, Eleanor. Eleanor's hands were shaking. She reached out. She picked up the envelope. The paper felt heavy, charged with the energy of a woman who had seen the future from a hospital bed. She slid her finger under the seal. She pulled out the letter. She unfolded it. Amos and Silas sat in absolute silence, giving her the room to read. Eleanor, my dear, reading this, the preacher kept his word, and you stayed past your 3 days. I am smiling as I write this, imagining you sitting in my kitchen, probably worrying that you are taking up too much space. Stop worrying. You belong there. I know you, Eleanor. I know the secret you carry. I know what that man in Boston did to you, and I know the ugly, wicked word he used to break your spirit. Barren? Eleanor gasped quietly. A tear immediately hit the paper. It is a lie, Eleanor. It is a lie created by men who measure a woman's worth by what she can harvest for them. God does not make mistakes. He did not build you broken. He built you with a capacity to love that is so massive, so fierce that one child could never have contained it. I spent 4 months watching you. I saw you soothe the sick. I saw you hold the hands of the dying. I saw a mother, not by blood, but by spirit, by choice. I am leaving this field too soon. I am leaving a good man drowning in grief, 9 children who are going to be so angry and so lost without a mother to guide them. I am not asking you to replace me. No one can do that, and I am not giving you my family as a burden. I am offering them to you as a gift. They need a mother, Eleanor, and you need a family to pour all that love into. Do not let a doctor's note define your life. Do not let a coward in Boston tell you what you are. Step into that house, love my husband, love my children. Be the mother you were always meant to be. You are not barren, Eleanor. You are blooming. Let them see it. With all my love in this life and the next, Abigail. Eleanor finished reading. She tried to take a breath, but she couldn't. The dam finally broke. The heavy, suffocating iron armor she had worn for 2 years, shame. The feeling of being defective, the quiet desperation shattered into a million pieces. She dropped the letter on the table. She put her hands over her face and sobbed. It wasn't a delicate cry. It was the deep, racking sobs of a woman who was finally laying down a burden she was never meant to carry. She wept for the years she lost. She wept for the cruelty of her ex-husband. And she wept for Abigail, the beautiful, selfless woman who had reached across the veil of death to set her free. Amos stood up. He placed a gentle hand on Eleanor's shoulder for just a moment. Then he quietly walked out the back door, leaving them alone. Silas didn't say anything. He didn't offer empty words to try and stop her crying. He just stood up, walked around the table, and pulled a chair right up next to hers. He sat down. He reached out and pulled her into his chest. Eleanor leaned into him. She buried her face in his flannel shirt, crying until her lungs burned. Silas wrapped his massive arms around her. He held her tight. He was a mountain, anchoring her in the storm. He rested his chin on the top of her head, closing his eyes, letting her grieve the life she had lost, so she could finally accept the life she had found. Thursday morning, the stagecoach was due at noon. Eleanor stood in the center of her small room at Beatrice's boarding house. She folded her gray wool skirt. She laid it flat in her travel bag. She smoothed the wrinkles out with slow, deliberate hands. Her hands were steady, but her chest felt entirely hollowed out. 12 days. She had come to Blackwood Pine for 3. She looked at the small wooden desk by the window. Abigail's letter sat there, the 12th envelope. Eleanor had read it so many times the parchment was soft. You are not barren, Eleanor. You are blooming. Let them see it. The words were a balm. They had broken the iron cage she'd lived in for 2 years. Abigail had reached across the veil of death and handed Eleanor the key to her own life. But breaking the cage didn't mean she knew how to fly. Eleanor picked up the letter. She folded it carefully. She tucked it into the inside pocket of her coat, right over her heart. She wanted to stay. God. She wanted to stay. She wanted to wake up at 5 in the morning and smell the wood smoke. She wanted to hear Gideon's boots stomping across the floorboards. She wanted to sit with Silas on the porch when the day was done, sharing a silence that wasn't heavy or broken but whole. But the ghost of Boston was a stubborn thing. Josiah's voice echoed in her memory. You are defective. You have nothing to offer a family. What if Josiah was right in a different way? She didn't know how to run a mountain ranch. She didn't know how to raise 9 children who were already half-grown and hurting. What if she stayed and she failed them? What if she couldn't fill the massive gaping hole Abigail had left behind? It was better to leave now. Better to be a fond memory than a present disappointment. Eleanor closed the travel bag. She fastened the brass buckles. They snapped shut with a harsh, final sound. She picked up the bag. She walked downstairs. The diner was quiet. The morning rush was over. Beatrice was behind the counter, wiping down the scarred wood. She looked up when Eleanor reached the bottom of the stairs. Beatrice looked at the travel bag. She didn't smile. She didn't offer a polite goodbye. "The stagecoach is on time," Beatrice said. Her voice was flat, disappointed. "I know," Eleanor said softly. She set her bag by the door. She pulled on her gloves. She stared out the frosted window, waiting for the heavy rumble of the coach wheels. The door didn't open politely. It swung wide. It hit the wall with a loud crack. Silas Montgomery stood in the doorway. He didn't look like a man coming to pay his respects. He looked like a storm, rolling right off the ridge. He wore his heavy canvas coat. His hat was pulled low. He was breathing hard like he'd ridden his horse half to death to get down the mountain in time. He stepped inside. He ignored Beatrice. He ignored the empty diner tables. His eyes locked entirely on Eleanor. Then he looked down at the travel bag sitting by her boots. The muscle in his jaw tightened. He walked over. He didn't ask if he could speak. He didn't care about manners. He just stopped right in front of her, close enough that she could smell the pine resin and the cold mountain air clinging to his clothes. "The coach is coming," Eleanor whispered. She couldn't look him in the eye. "I know," Silas said. "I kept my promise, Silas. I delivered the letter. I stayed my 3 days. It's time for me to go." "Go where?" Silas asked. His voice was a low, vibrating rumble. "Back to Kansas? To a rented room? To strangers?" Eleanor flinched. "I have to." "Why?" She finally looked up. The tears were already there, blurring her vision. "Because I don't belong here, Silas," she said, her voice breaking. "I don't know how to run a ranch. I don't know how to be what those children need. I'm afraid." She took a shaky breath. She forced herself to say the ugly truth out loud one last time, to completely sever the tie. "I am a discarded woman," Eleanor cried softly. "I have no land. I have no name. I can never give you a child of your own. I have nothing to offer you." Silas didn't back away. He stepped closer. He reached out. He took both of her hands in his. His hands were massive, calloused, rough from years of chopping wood and breaking ice. But his grip was warm. It was an anchor. "Stop!" Silas commanded. It wasn't a yell. It was absolute authority. He held her hands tight, forcing her to stay present, forcing her to listen. "I don't give a damn what some coward in Boston told you," Silas said. His eyes burned into hers with a fierce, terrifying clarity. "I don't care about a doctor's note. I don't care about biology. You listen to me, Eleanor." He paused. He waited until she stopped trembling. "I have 9 kids," Silas said slowly. "I don't need you to give me another one. That's not what makes a family." He let the words sink in. This was the truth, the raw, bleeding truth of the mountain. "What I need," Silas continued, his voice dropping to a rough whisper, "what they need is the woman who ripped her own skirt to stop Gideon from bleeding. The woman who sat up and listened to Hannah Red when she hadn't spoken in months. The woman who stands shoulder to shoulder with me in the dirt and holds the line." He let go of her hands. He reached up and gently cupped her face. "A woman's worth isn't measured by what her body can produce," Silas said. "The educational value of the moment wasn't a lecture. It was a vow. It's measured by who she chooses to love, and you spouse my kids. You chose me." Eleanor stopped breathing. The tears spilled over, running hot over his rough fingers. "You aren't broken, Eleanor," Silas said. "You aren't barren. You just haven't been planted in the right dirt yet." He dropped his hands. He reached down and picked up her travel bag. "So," Silas said, stepping back and holding the door open, "come home." Eleanor stood frozen. Outside, she heard the heavy rumble of wheels. The stagecoach was pulling into town. The horses whinnied. The driver shouted out. It was her ticket out, her safe, lonely retreat. She looked at the stagecoach through the window. Then she looked at Silas. The ghost of Boston finally died right there on the floorboards of Beatrice's diner. It shattered into dust, blown away by the mountain wind. Eleanor didn't say yes. Words were too small. She walked forward. She walked right past the open door, past the waiting stagecoach, and out into the muddy street. She walked toward the wagon. Silas had parked by the trough. She was going home 1 year later. Spring came early to Blackwood Pine. The snow melted off the lower ridges by April, turning the valley green and the roads to thick mud. Beatrice Alden stood by the front window of her boarding house. She held a rag in her hand. She watched the stagecoach roll into town. A woman stepped down from the coach. She wore a stiff wool coat. She held a small bag clutched tight to her chest. She looked around at the rough wooden buildings, her eyes wide with a mix of fear and exhaustion. Beatrice smiled faintly. She remembered another woman exactly 1 year ago, standing in that very spot holding a leather pouch. Beatrice turned away from the window and went back to wiping the counter. The town hadn't changed much, but the people in it had. 4 miles up the ridge, the Montgomery Ranch was loud. It wasn't a chaotic, panicked loud. It was the rich, steady sound of a house that was fully alive. Eleanor sat on the wide front porch. The afternoon sun was warm. She wore a faded blue cotton dress. The hem was stained with dirt. She didn't care. She held a small chalkboard in her lap. Hannah sat beside her, carefully writing out her letters. Gideon was hanging upside down off the porch rail. "Gideon, you're going to break your neck," Rebecca called out from the kitchen window. She was smiling. The sharp, bitter edge to her voice was completely gone. She was 15 now. She was allowed to be 15 again, because she wasn't carrying the weight of a mother anymore. Elias rode into the yard on a roan gelding. He tipped his hat to Eleanor. He was heading off to the mining college in Denver next fall. Silas had agreed to it. Eleanor had helped fill out the paperwork. Eleanor watched him ride to the barn. She felt a deep, profound peace settle over her chest. Silas walked out of the barn a moment later. He carried a coiled rope over his broad shoulder. He stopped in the middle of the muddy yard. He looked up at the porch. He looked at Eleanor. He didn't wave. He didn't shout. He just stood there and looked at her. The silence between them wasn't a wall anymore. It was a bridge. It was the quiet, unbreakable communication of two people who had built a life out of broken pieces. Suddenly, the front door banged open. Little Samuel waddled out onto the porch. He was 2.5 years old now. He had Silas' dark hair and Abigail's bright eyes. He was running too fast. His boot caught on a raised nail in the floorboard. He fell hard. He didn't cry. He scrambled right back up, his little hands covered in dust. He looked around frantically until his eyes landed on Eleanor. He ran straight for a chair. He threw his arms around Bugs and buried his face in her skirt. "Mama!" Samuel yelled happily. Eleanor set her chalkboard down. She reached down, scooped the heavy toddler up, and pulled him into her lap. She kissed the top of his dusty head. She wrapped her arms around him, breathing in the smell of soap and sunshine. She looked up across the yard. Silas tipped his weathered Stetson to her. A slow, easy, genuine smile broke across his face. Eleanor Vance was a Barren woman, according to the laws of Boston. But the laws of Boston didn't mean a damn thing on this mountain. She held her son tight against her chest. She looked at her loud, messy, beautiful family, and she knew with the absolute certainty of a deeply rooted tree that she had finally found the perfect soil to bloom. This story is designed as cinematic long-form entertainment and may contain exaggerated emotions, dramatic coincidences, or heightened tension to create a more engaging experience for viewers. Certain scenes have been intentionally intensified for storytelling and emotional impact.
Eleanor Vance didn't come to Blackwood Pine looking for a family. She came to keep a promise to the dead. She came to deliver a leather pouch full of letters, stay 3 days, and leave. That was the plan. That was the cage she built for herself. Neat, manageable, and safe. Because Eleanor had learned, in the coldest courtroom in Boston, that wanting more than your station allows is a dangerous thing for a woman the world has already decided is broken. The first and most shattering truth this story gives us is this: the cruelest lies are the ones we accept from people who had no right to speak them. A doctor wrote one word on a piece of paper. A coward in a suit read it aloud in front of a judge. And Eleanor carried that word, Barren, like a stone around her neck for 2 full years. She let it hollow her out. She let it define the borders of her world. She ran to Kansas and ministered to the dying because she had decided that if she couldn't create life, she would at least serve those leaving it. It was noble. It was also a form of hiding. But Abigail Montgomery saw through it from a sickbed 400 miles from home. She saw a woman with a mother's hands, a mother's instincts, and a mother's heart. And she did something extraordinary. From her deathbed, with failing lungs and a fading grip on her pen, she built a bridge, not between Eleanor and Silas, between Eleanor and herself, between Eleanor and the truth that Boston had buried. And that is the second great lesson of this story. We cannot always save the people we love in time, but we can leave them a map. Abigail couldn't survive. She couldn't go home. She couldn't tuck her children in or sit beside Silas at that heavy oak table. But she could write. She could choose her words with extraordinary care, seal them with lavender, and trust a tired stranger to carry them across the snow. She could plant a seed in the dark and trust the spring to do the rest. Silas, for his part, was drowning. He woke up at 5 in the morning every single day and pushed himself through the silence by sheer force of will, because if he stopped moving, the grief would swallow him whole. He held a baby with lung fever through 18 sleepless nights rather than write a letter that would break his dying wife's heart. He chose the silence. He bore the weight of it alone. And his daughter nearly never forgave him for it. But here is what that moment in the kitchen teaches us when Silas finally broke and told the truth. Silence isn't always cowardice. Sometimes it is the heaviest act of love a person can carry. And sometimes the people we protect ourselves from the most are the very people who would understand us best if we only had the courage to speak. Gideon choosing Eleanor, Samuel calling her mama, Rebecca's arms wrapping around her father's neck, Hannah finally reading aloud. These were not moments written in any courthouse document. No law recognized them. No bloodline certified them. They were just the daily, relentless, unremarkable choices of people who decided to love each other and kept deciding morning after morning in the mud and the cold and the noise of a fully alive house. The laws of Boston said Eleanor was barren. The mountain said otherwise. A woman's worth, a person's worth, is not measured by what their body can produce. It is not measured by the verdict of a man who needed someone to blame for his own disappointment. It is measured by who they choose to love when no one is watching, by the skirt they tear to stop the bleeding, by the hymn they sing in the dirt, by the nail they hold steady while someone else drives it home. Eleanor didn't replace Abigail. She couldn't. Nobody could. But she did something just as sacred. She stepped into the cold, muddy gap that grief had left behind, and she planted herself there. She put down roots in soil that the world had called dead. And on a spring afternoon, with a 2-year-old boy clinging to her skirt and calling her mama across a sunlit porch, every word Boston ever said about her burned away in the mountain air. She was not barren. She never was. She had simply been waiting for the right place to bloom.